Thank you again for joining today's session. For you, or all of you that have joined sessions with us previously, these are to give you guys a bit of an insight into various ways that we can work and problems that are in the market when it comes to global expansion and solutions that we offer. Today's session is about overcoming the challenges when using a PEO. Now, for you that weren't on the previous session, we'll have a quick recap of what we perceive as PEO or EOR, give a bit of a summary of what we covered previously, and then we'll jump into the context of today's session. So just to give a few introductions again for the few of you that don't know who I am, I'm James Adkins. I'm the commercial lead at UnaTerra, specialising in HR. We've also got my colleague Julian. Julian, do you want to give a bit of background on you?
I certainly will. Thanks, James. Just coming off mute. Yeah, hi, everybody. So I'm one of the founders of UnaTerra. Been working in this international expansion, payroll and HR space for about 15 years. And I've worked with some really big ticket companies on their international expansion historically. And today at UnaTerra, we support about 170 clients with their international expansion needs, principally payroll and HR, but also some other areas. And my principal role here at UnaTerra is attracting and securing new business.
Thank you, Julian. We're very fortunate to have with us today, because of the subject that we're covering, colleague and our expert, Miriam Roberts. So welcome, Miriam.
Thank you. For anyone that doesn't know me, I head up the international HR team at UnaTerra. I have 12 years experience in HR. A number of those years have been spent in the international HR field. My experience is everything from international employment law to change management, E&D, performance management and employee engagement. I've been fortunate enough to work across a number of sectors, everything from FMCG to healthcare to food manufacturing. And I've worked across a number of countries, everywhere from Japan, Singapore to Germany, France, Netherlands, down South Africa and the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So that's who we are and a bit about us and what we do. So before we go into the context of today's session, I think probably worth addressing how we got here. So on the previous session that we did, I think it was about a month or so ago, lots of questions came up when we were talking about the difference between PEO and payroll services and what are the, I wouldn't want to use the words pros and cons, but the advantages, disadvantages of different nuances when it comes to those services. Lots of questions that came up were about, well, actually, how does HR fit into that and how do we support from the ongoing perspective? So we decided to do the follow-on session from today of that and the challenges that have come up from that. I think it's probably worth, from a context perspective, just to give a bit of an overview of what we covered. So Julian, could you really kind of high level, just quickly summarize a couple of minutes of what we covered last and what were the main points?
Certainly, James, I certainly will. So the two main areas that came out of the last webinar, one of them was looking at compliance risks and in essence, you know, the options that face you when you're looking to employ people in other countries, being direct employment, so employing them as a direct employee of your business or running through a third party, which would be on a PEO arrangement. What protection or assurances do you as a business get from a compliance perspective? Very key area, because of course employment is very sort of compliance driven in terms of having to comply lots of different areas. Employment law, fundamentally, you get coverage through both. So you know, one of the great things about PEO is that it gives you a very immediate solution to a sort of burning employment law risk or issue. It's fairly immediate. You get that with a direct employment as well, as along, of course, if you have a fully compliant employment contract. So employment law is covered by both. And then there are various areas which aren't covered so well or at all by the PEO arrangement, and it can depend on what the employees are doing or how many of them there are in a country. But in essence, if you choose to employ people directly, you control all of the risks, or at least you have the ability to control all of the risks. So for example, permanent establishment, which is, so we covered that in detail in the last webinar, but permanent establishment risk is the risk that you inadvertently expose your business to an unintended tax consequence or exposure in another country or in a particular country. If you employ people directly, whether or not you have a legal entity, you have all those decisions and you have the power to control that yourself. PEO doesn't give you any protection from permanent establishment risk. Stock options is a bit of a grey area. You can always be fully compliant from a stock option perspective if you're employing people directly. Very grey area, very complicated area, the area of stock options as regards employing through a third party, because of course it's an employment related mechanism, but actually you're fracturing the employment relationship by putting that employee with a third party. So you don't really get compliance from a stock option perspective. Transfer pricing, you can't control transfer pricing if you don't have a legal entity or the right sort of tax structures and mechanisms to control and be compliant from a transfer pricing perspective. And also visa sponsorship can be different. It is actually possible to get visa sponsorship through a PEO, but it's variable and it can be quite complex. So obviously employing people directly, you always have the ability to put things in place so that you can sponsor visas and move people around. So those are the compliance areas covered. PEO gives you that very immediate fix of how do I satisfy my employment law requirements, whereas direct employment gives you the ability to cover off all of those other areas. The other area beyond compliance was actually what's going to, from the point of view of your business, what's going to drive the decision making, and you know there were various things that came up, and we actually ran a poll during the course of the webinar, and you know we asked what drives the business decisions, and actually employee experience I think came out top. Combination of employee experience and culture. You know, with the PEO, you're more or less outsourcing the whole of the employee experience, including the onboarding process. And with a direct payrolling arrangement, you have the ability again to control and influence and change the onboarding experience, change the benefits package, change frankly whatever you like. Culturally, direct employment, I think it's very difficult to argue that PEO is ever going to be better than a direct relationship from a sort of company culture perspective, inclusiveness and sort of belonging to the corporate family. Certainly if you're in an urgent position, you really need to onboard somebody with great urgency. PEO wins hands down because it's usually something that can be implemented within literally a small number of business days. You know, payrolling can take, depending on the country, it can take anything from, again, a few days all the way through to a few months. So it's very variable. If it's urgent, there's no doubt that PEO wins. Perhaps it's an immediate solution, which can then later be transitioned to a different arrangement. Cost is often a business decision that sits just underneath the employee experience and culture. The answer to cost is it depends, because costs vary very much from one country to the next, frankly, for both solutions. So it's very much a country by country issue, and it also depends on the headcount and how much people are earning, because PEO costs tend to vary according to salary levels. And we can always answer questions about cost, and we're quite good at comparing PEO cost versus payroll. So something we do a lot for our clients. So cost, it depends. Compliance, we've already talked about. Payroll does definitely give a much greater ability to be as compliant as possible. And the final one then is complexity of market. So in terms of business decision, if you're looking to hire in very complex markets, in the short term, certainly PEO wins every time. In the longer term, and as you scale a team and build the headcount, then direct employment is likely to be the more attractive option. It's going to be cheaper, and it's going to tick the boxes of employee experience and culture as well. So very much a mixed bag when it comes to business decisions, but certainly typically PEO prevails when there is short-termism in the air, where it's urgent, and payrolling tends to be a better solution. You know, if these hires are longer term, if there are more of them. So I think, James, that fairly well recaps on what we talked about on the last webinar.
Thank you. brief as always, Julian.
Try to be.
Yes. So obviously jumping on for the content for today. So from, as we mentioned, the takeaways from the previous session, we're now looking at the challenges from a HR perspective. So appreciate that a lot of people on this session today might wear different hats. So might sit in a finance function, may sit in a HR function, might sit in a operational day-to-day function, but this is more from an angle from a HR perspective. So we'll look at addressing the main 4 areas that we've kind of pulled out from this to address, which is the affordability section, employee engagement or staff engagement as a whole, the risks that's associated to it from a HR perspective, and then the retention piece. So that's everything all the way through to separation of the employee and what sort of challenges that come up. So I will, the idea is to run a quick poll throughout this. There'll be various bits that kind of pop up that we'd encourage you to engage with. And there's also a chat function if you have any questions that you specifically want to be answered. At the end of the session, we'll try and address those points. But if anything comes through that I'll notice, we'll try and add it into the conversation, or as I say, if not, we'll address it at the end. So if we could pop up the poll, which is about what's the main focus for the HR team for this coming year. So we're working in an environment where compliance is obviously the fundamental piece that we all kind of work towards, but there's a lot of challenges when it comes to remote working and how can we adapt that from a policy perspective. Then we've also got the benefits piece that comes into that, which is, are people having the right benefits, or are they motivated? And then we've got the performance and learning and development piece. So if I could ask you all just to pop some answers on the poll that's popped up. And again, I'll try and steer things today in a way that will address the main areas. So I'll just wait for those to come through. Perfect. So we've got a bit of a mixed bag from today's audience. By that, the main push is towards compliance. As I say, we'll try and address that as much as possible. That'll probably fall under the risk section. But the engagement piece obviously does cover that as well. And then we'll try and pick up the other points as we move through. So I'll talk a little bit about the affordability piece. So what we find from a client's perspective when they come to us looking at a solution to go into a new country, PEO does come up in conversation when it tends to be low headcount numbers or a location that requires quite a complex setup. So PEO, but I'm again assuming that you all know, but I'll just do a brief summary. PEO is third-party employment, stands for Professional Employee Organisation. Some people refer to it as EOR, which is an employer of record. There are various different terms out there that people use. Using one of those solutions, the third-party company picks up the employment of the employee, and you can basically employ someone tomorrow. How that works from an affordability perspective is that actually they charge you as a client or whomever a fee to employ that person on your behalf. So those costs can be quite expensive, but they certainly make sure that the solution is there from day one, and you have access to various other things that Miriam will cover there. As headcounts increase from 1, 2, 3, if you are scaling in a country, it can become quite a non-cost-effective solution. So it tends to be a tipping point that people will hit a couple of employees or time scale of saying, well, actually, we've been in this country for 6, 9 months, a year. Let's set up an entity or payroll registration and start employing people directly and transfer across. So there are, from an affordability perspective, I would encourage people to start looking at what the longer term plan is. Where you see yourself, not just in the short term. Yes, we need to hire someone pretty soon, but what does the next 6 to 12 months look like, and then what is happening thereafter? With that additional cost that comes into play, because we all work into budgets that we all need to work towards, is actually if we've got this additional cost that's coming on top of the solution through this third-party charges, can we afford the total compensation or the benefits offering within that package, or do we need to go back to an investment company or board and say we need a bigger budget for this role, because actually the additional costs that are layering on top and all the third-party fees that come into that can be quite high. So I would always encourage, when you're looking at affordability and are looking at these sorts of solutions, is ask as many questions from a provider, whether it's UnaTerra or whether it's someone else. Ask all the questions, because unfortunately what happens in these situations, they'll speak to you about a cost, but what they won't speak to you about is, well, actually, you've got the benefits charges on top, you've got any consultancy support, any advisory support on top of that. All of these sorts of things, I would encourage you all to ask questions when you're talking to a provider. So that I will, as I say, I've covered affordability. As we do have a specialist here, which is Merrin, I'll pass across to Merrin to talk about the next few subjects, because again, day to day is something that she does day in, day out. So Merrin, over to you.
Thank you, James. As James mentioned earlier, if you have any questions as I go through, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll try and address them as I'm speaking. So the first area to talk about is in regards to risk. With a PEO, you're essentially leasing your employees and co-employing those workers. This comes with the benefit of sharing the risk and liability with the PEO. This is because the company's employees are incorporated under the PEO's tax ID. They'll also help you manage tasks such as workers' compensation reporting. And this also may end up in a reduction in your HR workload because you're sharing that responsibility with the PEO. The PEO will help you with the employee life cycle from end to end. So they'll assist you from the onboarding right through to the end of employment. And you'd like to think they'll assist you with the HR compliance, they'll have up-to-date documents, etc. On the flip side, though you are sharing that risk and liability with the PEO, this does mean that you're relinquishing quite a lot of control. Since your employees are co-employed by the PEO, you will have to contact them if any issues arise, which can be inefficient. It can lead to delays. They'll also want to assist you in the management of those employees rather than you doing it yourselves. Whereas when you're working with a consultancy firm or a payroll provider, they'll give you the advice and support and documentation, and then you can actually manage those HR services directly yourself. This results often in the loss of control over your internal processes. So I mentioned they can control nearly every aspect of HR. And that isn't really ideal for businesses that want to have that control within their HR teams or work with a provider to be an extension of their team rather than actually kind of them taking over the HR processes. Another area to be aware of is the in-country limitations, particularly when you're expanding. There are some really clear examples where a PEO might not be the right solution for you long term. One of the great examples of this is Germany. In Germany, if you're working with an employer of record model, that's known as labour leasing. There is a very strict time limitation in Germany. So an EOR can't employ a client's employees for more than a period of 18 months. When that 18-month period is reached, the business would either have to let the employee go or hire them directly through a local business structure or entity. So in terms of long-term employment for a country like Germany and others, a PEO model might not be the right solution, and obviously that could then lead into employee engagement and retention issues. Another area to consider is in terms of the collective agreement responsibilities. For those that don't know, a collective bargaining agreement is really the main source of employment law in many countries. Very prime examples of this are in France and Spain, where the majority of employees and companies will be bound by a collective bargaining agreement. We'll use France as an example. So in France, you will find that the main source of employment law is the French Labour Code, collective bargaining agreements, and employment contracts. If there's ever a dispute, or a litigation case, the court will always weigh in the favour of the one which is most advantageous to the employee. Where you can run into difficulties with the PEO is where they may either not have covered you with a collective bargaining agreement, or that you're bound by the collective bargaining agreement specific to the PEO. Given that a collective bargaining agreement is led by an employee's industry and the type of business that they're in, it may not be beneficial or the best option for yourselves. to go with the CBA that you're bound under with the PEO, just because it's got such an impact on the employee, and that will impact everything from their holiday entitlement to minimum salary requirements, overtime working, etc. So you just need to be very sure about which collective bargaining agreement you fall under.
Miriam, before we jump on to the next slide, on collective agreements and the other bits that you've mentioned when it comes to the in-country limitations, do you find that the employment contract that's issued by said third party is always fully understood by the client, or is it something that is kind of just sent across and said, okay, here are the agreement that we offer, this is what the employee is engaged under, and in the nicest possible way deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. So in my experience, what's happened with PEOs is they will have a very set employment contract. They may be able to do minor amendments, but they won't be able to do specific tailoring, and they will expect the client and employees to really just sign and get on with it, as you say. When you're working with a provider such as a consultancy firm, they'll be able to do a lot more tailoring, and they'll also do simple things like pick up the phone to the client or the employee and talk them through any questions that they might have about the clauses. And when you're looking at a lot of country, the clauses aren't straightforward. They're often in dual language. So having that softer touch to walk a client or employee through can be very, very beneficial.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before I move on to the next slide?
Too many, but don't worry. We're conscious of time.
Thank you. Okay, the next slide is on the employee engagement piece, which is obviously a clear focus area for HR and has been for a while. As James and Julian mentioned, PEOs can be really good for a fast onboarding. So if you need to just get somebody working for you ASAP, they're a great solution. They can give you access to HR services that small business might not otherwise be able to afford. So this could be training, onboarding, recruiting. That very much depends on the PEO and whether that's an additional cost, etc. So that's a conversation you'd need to have with them. For that reason, they can be an attractive option for small companies that are looking to recruit and attract top talent. In terms of benefits, which is obviously a clear attractive piece for many employees, particularly those at the higher end, and they can really lead to employee engagement and good retention. You may find with PEOs that they offer lower costs of benefits offerings. The reason for because PEOs work with a multitude of businesses, and they have a large pool of employees that they can put forward to the benefits providers, which can then result in lower group insurance costs with the providers, and that cost is then obviously passed on to the clients. This is sometimes a better option for people if that rather than them shopping for insurance on their own, if they just want a quick fix solution. On the flip side, in terms of employee engagement, what I've often seen is there's a lack of employee understanding as to what a PEO model is. A lot of employees don't understand what it is, and it may result in them feeling like they're being negatively leased to PEO. Sometimes employees will go through the whole recruitment stage, and only at the end, when they're issued with a contract, they're realizing that actually they're not being employed directly by the company that they thought they were being recruited by. And I've seen some very key individuals being lost as a result of that. Alongside that, because the contracts are so set in their terms of PEOs, a lot of employees will want to have some negotiation with their potential employer, and that may not be an option for them. In terms of them feeling leased to the PEO, we have seen that employee morale and productivity can take a hit as a result of that, which is obviously something most companies want to try and avoid. Obviously, all this can lead to potential impact on the company culture. As mentioned before, employees will often feel undervalued, underutilized, and that they're not really working for the people that they feel like they should be working for. So it might not be a longer term solution for anyone trying to recruit particularly top talent. In terms of benefits offerings, so you may find that they're cheaper. They can be very limited. What you'll be losing is the ability to actually customize a benefits plan that meets not only your needs as an employer, but also your employee needs. This can be really simple things like choosing the right healthcare insurance, the right pension provision for your employees. the PEOs will have already established benefit plans with the providers, so there's less flexibility for clients or businesses to choose which benefits to opt for. The other thing to be aware of is that PEOs can switch their providers at any time without consulting their clients. And obviously this can lead to fluctuating prices and unsatisfied employees. A lot of employees, they just want a nice, steady, stable offering. That very limited choice in carriers can mean that you're not actually presenting the best option for your employees and their families. Any questions, James?
So we have had a question come through actually on benefits. So the question notes about the life insurance cover that they offer as a company. We can't necessarily say what PEO providers will offer. Each PEO company is very different from the benefit suite that they offer. But if, as a rule of thumb, say you do 10 times life cover, I would say that if you are entering into a third-party arrangement, don't commit to any sort of percentages when it comes to that sort of level of coverage, because you can't necessarily guarantee that that will be available through them. If you are employing someone directly, generally speaking, Merin and her team or whomever can go out to market and source specific benefits for organisations directly, but through third party, your hands are slightly tied. So always err on the side of caution when you're negotiating with a new candidate or a new hire when you're entering a new country.
Thank you, James, for that clarification. Okay, anything else on engagement before I move on to retention?
I don't think so, Merin.
Great, thank you. Can we move? Thank you very much. So in terms of retention, obviously this is very linked into employee engagement. So there'll be some bits that I've already covered, but I'm very keen to talk about this as a separate matter because it's so important for businesses, particularly when you're looking at things like cost savings. Obviously, the better retention you have, the lower costs you're going to have. So really most companies and clients that we're looking at, they really want to look at whether they're creating the right culture for their staff or whether or not their staff are going to leave. So PEOs can support with that employee life cycle, which may lead to better retention. And that having that HR support for small businesses throughout that life cycle, again, can lead to better retention. It generally only works with the smaller businesses that need that quick onboarding. They can also do a smooth benefits implementation. Because their benefits are already up and running, it's often a simple case of signing the employee onto that benefits platform that I've already got there. On the flip side, there can be a negative impact on the company culture. As I mentioned previously, whether employees understand what a PEO model is, whether they've got issues over their benefits offering and really aren't happy with the lack of flexibility with PEO models, this can impact on the company culture. We really do see many people feeling that they want to be employed directly by the company that they're working for. There's often a lot of pride when individuals are working for a company, and when their contract doesn't reflect that, it's surprising how difficult they can find that. There is that lack of control over the employee life cycle. So when you're going through any kind of performance or capability management, you're looping in the PEO, it takes away that personalized value. On the flip side, things like salary increase letters, etc., when they're not coming from yourselves directly and might be coming from the PEO, employees again can wonder who the third party is and feel very disengaged from them. And then the last area to cover is about the resistance to co-employment relationships. So I briefly mentioned co-employment relationships may not work best for employees. They do want to have a direct employer. It can lead to an awful lot of confusion and difficulties, and therefore resulting in lower retention within the staff. Any questions on retention at all?
Thank you, Merin. Conscious of time, so there have been a few questions that have come through, and I will direct them to you offline, Merin, so it may be something that we'll go back to the people that raised the questions. I think just as a kind of quick summary about a few of the HR challenges that you've just spoken through and we've addressed, is that generally speaking, it's that control aspect of the relationship. It's something that's out of your hands. So we do get often asked questions about intellectual property and various clauses that people want to put into certain agreements. Because that's through a third party, the liability and the responsibility of everything within that relationship is generally speaking inserted into a clause within the agreement to say that's actually your responsibility to take care of separately. And again, from a risk and highlighting perspective, any sort of engagement you do, ask as many questions as you can, see whether something's recorded within the agreements, with whether that's between yourself as a client and the provider, or whether it's something that's in the agreement between the employee and the third party. Makes it sound quite complex, but it can be quite straightforward and certainly be fit for purpose if you need it. So thank you again, Marion. As I say, conscious of time, so we'll just try and wrap this up. But there is a quick another poll that I'd like to do. It might have an impact on our next session, and also what we may come back to you on. So we've gone through affordability, risk, engagement, and retention. I think from an answers perspective is if you could put some answers in the poll of what have your main challenges been whilst using these third-party employers, and if there have been too many. Obviously a cheeky question at the end of too many and we need some help, and we'll obviously come back to you and help you directly. So again, a couple of seconds just to wait for the responses to come in on that. And thank you all for taking part in the polls. I know they can be irritating. Thank you. Yeah, the responses are coming back as I expected. So thank you very much. So Julian sat there nice and quietly for the last 10 minutes or so. So Julian, if we just move on to a quick kind of wrap up. I know that you gave a really high level overview on that and when you did the introduction, but just a kind of few notes to wrap up today's session, and then I'll speak about the next and obviously the next steps thereafter.
Yeah, very quickly, James, and thanks. Just literally 30 seconds, just to kind of recap on this table here, which is, in terms of a business decision to engage your employees through a PEO or to engage them directly. I won't talk through the table again, but I think it's really worth laying out what's really what are the key determinants in the decision making and what's really driving the decision making. And that will enable you to understand which of these solutions is likely to be the better one for your business. And sometimes the immediacy of PEO can be very, very attractive, especially if a decision is being driven by a higher up, somebody who's just saying, I don't care what it costs, let's just get this person on board. 6 months down the track, it can seem like it wasn't such a great idea. Something we're very good at is advising and counseling clients on what's right for the circumstances and what's best for the circumstances. And it can literally just be a phone call and a discussion about, okay, what's the urgency with the person? Is there an opportunity to work it a certain way? How about going with PEO as a stopgap measure while we get a payroll up and running? That can often be quite acceptable to the employees that Marion referenced, who actually aren't taken by the idea of going on a third-party payroll. But if you offer it up as an interim solution while we get a new payroll set up, then that's likely to appease them, and they like to feel much more taken care of and accommodated in the business. So I just I think as an overview, I think it's worth contemplating the different factors that play a part and making sure that the decision you make isn't just right for today, but is also one that's going to be right for the business as you scale and as time goes by over the coming 6 or 12 months.
Thank you, Julian. So there has actually been quite a glowing chat that's just come through. Marion, have you seen the messages come through? Would you mind just quickly, as high level as possible, conscious again of time? But
absolutely. So it's come out of the polls. Somebody's just put a statement down about benefits and trying to pick the ones employees want. So PEO, that is definitely limited because they will give you those limited benefits offerings. When you're looking at another provider, like a payroll provider, benefits consultancy, etc. So ourselves, we would go to market, we would approach you with benefits offerings that would work for your business. That would be based on things like your employee headcount, the industry that you're in, etc. And then you'd be able to pick the right offering for yourselves and the employees.
Thank you, Marion. So we are doing or trying to, or potentially carrying on this series of how best to, I suppose, look at the PEO market space, because a lot of people kind of fall into that funnel accidentally when they are searching for various providers, etc. So the next session we'll be doing is when is the right time to switch, if it is a decision that you're looking at making. Part of that exercise, and there'll be a link that follows this that you're welcome to either click on or reach out to me directly, is that part of the series we're offering the people that are listening the resource of a health check. So we have a health check function within our business that we can look at various, it's not a complete health check of the whole business, it's from our HR perspective, and we're happy to do that. So I'd welcome you all to reach out to me if that's something that you require. But thank you all for joining. Thank you, Marion. As always, thank you, Julian. And hopefully we get to see you all again on the next session.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.